there's this notion out there that Anthony Joshua has never actually beaten a young, in-shape heavyweight who is actually any good in his entire career. And this not only delegitimizes his previous stint as unified heavyweight champion, but it's also an ominous sign going into this fight against Daniel Dubois, because Daniel Dubois, of course, is a young, in-shape heavyweight, and in the minds of many people, at least coming off the back of his 2 wins over Jerome Miller and Filip Hrgović, actually is pretty good. So let's examine this notion. If we have a look at Anthony Joshua's record here, Ngannou was in his 30s, Wallin was in his 30s, Helenius in his 30s. I think Franklin was actually in his 20s, but a lot of people would say he was no good. He lost to Usyk on both occasions, so we don't need to count that. Pulev was in his 30s. Ruiz in the rematch, I think he might have still been in his 20s, but he was very, very overweight, so a lot of people won't count that. And he lost the first Ruiz fight. Povetkin was in his 30s. Joseph Parker was in his 20s at the time AJ beat him, and therefore this disproves the notion that AJ's never beat a young, in-shape heavyweight in their prime that was actually any good. No, he did do that when he beat Joseph Parker, who was 24-0 at the time. And given some of the wins that Joseph Parker has had since, this win for Anthony Joshua looks a bit better now, doesn't it? But is there anyone else other than Parker? Takam was in his 30s. Klitschko was in his 40s. Eric Molina was in his 30s. Dominic Breazeale may have been in his 20s at the time when AJ beat him, but I can't imagine there are many people who think Dominic Breazeale's any good. Charles Martin may have been in his 20s. I forget now when AJ beat him, but same thing there. I can't imagine there are many people who think that Martin is very good. And then finally, Dylan White. This was obviously before he became champion. He did beat Dylan White, who was in his 20s, but he was carrying a shoulder injury. And was he any good? Well, that's a subject that's debated still. But how did AJ get on against the young fighters he did face? Well, it was a struggle against Dylan White. He beat Martin and Breazeale easily enough. He beat Joseph Parker pretty comprehensively on the scorecards. Wasn't really one of his tougher fights. He beat Andy Ruiz in the rematch comprehensively on the scorecards. That was relatively straightforward. And he beat Jermaine Franklin comprehensively on the scorecards. That was straightforward as well. Again, I'm including all of the younger guys, not necessarily the younger guys who fans think were any good. So if we're assessing Anthony Joshua's resume purely based on the ages of the fighters that he beat, he did beat a few guys who were still in their 20s that were still useful like Parker. But is that the right way to actually rate his resume, assess his resume? Because Anthony Joshua's detractors are normally, not always, but normally either Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder fans. Well, how many young, in shape, in their 20s fighters who are actually any good have Fury or Wilder ever beat? With Deontay Wilder, the answer is nobody. He never beat any fighters that were actually any good in their 20s. Zero. And with Tyson Fury, Klitschko was in his late 30s. Wilder was in his 30s when Fury fought him. Dylan White was in his 30s. Chisora was in his late 30s. So same thing for Fury. Fury has never beat an in-shape heavyweight in their 20s that was actually any good. Anthony Joshua has. Not many, but there are some. And so again, I asked the question, is that really how we should be assessing somebody's resume, by how many fighters in their 20s they actually beat? Because if we look at AJ's resume again, he did get beat by Andy Ruiz, who was in his 20s at the time, I believe. But other than that, his toughest fights were actually with older fighters who evidently still had a decent amount left. During his championship run I'm talking about, obviously he had a very difficult fight with Dylan White. But in terms of his championship run, AJ's most difficult fights were with older guys. Vladimir Klitschko, Carlos Takam gave him an awkward night. Alexander Povetkin gave AJ some problems in the early going. And he was an older guy. He might have been 37 or 38 at the time when he fought AJ. And then, of course, he lost to Alexander Usyk. And Usyk was well into his 30s. What was he, 33 or something when he fought AJ, 34? Just because a guy's in their 30s, it doesn't mean that they're no good. It doesn't mean that they're over the hill, particularly in the heavyweight division where fighters tend to mature. Fighters tend to come into their own later than fighters in lower weight classes. And here's the kicker. So many people are saying that AJ's in trouble against Dubois because this is the first time he's fought a young guy in a long time, in many, many years. And so AJ's in grave danger here. But the thing is, Daniel Dubois has already lost to a couple of old men. Joe Joyce was in, his mid-30s when he beat Daniel Dubois, stopped him in 10 rounds, made him quit. So Dubois lost to an old man there 4 years ago. And more recently, he lost to another old man in Alexander Usyk, who was 37 at the time, 36? So while Dubois' youth gives him a certain amount of energy, strength, recklessness, fearlessness even. That youth hasn't proven to be such an overwhelming advantage that old men can't overcome it. Because as I say, Joe Joyce managed to overcome it, and so did Alexander Usyk. Anthony Joshua at 34 years of age still appears to be fast. He still appears to be relatively fresh. He hasn't had a ton of slugfests in his career. He's looked after himself. He doesn't blow up in weight in between fights. You don't see him falling out of bars drunk. Not everybody ages at the same rate. Some 40-year-old guys could pass for 30, not just in terms of their face, but even their physique, their lack of wrinkles, lack of grey. And some 30-year-old guys could be mistaken for 40 because they have all those signs of aging, not just externally, but sometimes internally as well, depending on their lifestyle and also genetics. With fighters, particularly heavyweights, you look at their body and you can see the aging in the condition of the muscle. Things start to sag as you get older. Your physique looks different. You're not quite as lean. You start to lose a little bit of muscle mass. With Anthony Joshua at 34 years of age, I'm yet to see any of that. Now, it's very possible that the damage for AJ is not so much physical, but psychological. Physically, he might still be close to his prime or in his prime, but psychologically, he might be past it. If Dubois manages to hurt him and turn it into a dogfight, will AJ react like a young, hungry, ambitious fighter? Or will he react like a jaded, older fighter who's got one foot in retirement? That is a legitimate question. Anyway, let me know what you guys think about all the points I've raised in this video. The notion that AJ was nothing but a paper champion because he never beat any young in their prime heavyweights. And the idea that his lack of young opposition over the past few years is going to hurt him against Daniel Dubois. And I'm not saying it won't, by the way. But one thing I think people should at least consider is the fact that AJ, even though he lost, has fought Alexander Usyk twice. And we saw in the Usyk-Dubois fight that Usyk is faster than Dubois, moves better than Dubois. He was one step ahead of Dubois through most of that fight. So does it really matter in that case that AJ hasn't fought a guy in their 20s for such a long time? I mean, again, Jermaine Franklin may have been in his 20s, but he's no great shakes. I suspect the experience of fighting Alexander Usyk twice will stand AJ in good stead against Daniel Dubois, just from a pace perspective. Dealing with someone who moves a lot, who has a lot of energy, who throws a lot of punches. That's my take. Give me your take in the comment section below. And before I go, make sure you check out my Joshua Dubois film study on my Patreon page. It's about an hour and 20 minutes long. I analyze actual video footage of several of their fights and do a technical breakdown of their respective strengths and weaknesses and discuss tactics. If you want to access this video along with hundreds of hours worth of other exclusive boxing content, as well as our members chat, just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called the Boxing Brotherhood. There's no contract, no commitment. You can cancel at any time, just like Netflix, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper. Just download the app from the Play Store or the App Store. All the links are in the description box below.